Hello and welcome to this AiM tutorial looking at how to use the channels report feature for vehicle health. Now in previous videos, which I will link to in the top right hand side, we have looked at basic channel report configuration and we've looked at max RPM analysis. This video we're going to have a look at minimum oil pressure analysis. So we're going to start off with the basic vehicle health report that has been created. This is one that I have for a Formula Ford, and you can see that we've got information. We've got max RPMs, we've got external voltage, we've got oil pressure in minimum, average and maximum, same thing for water temperature. But one of the things you may notice if we got these two channels here, minimum oil pressure in time and minimum oil pressure in distance. What I've done is I've created a math channel, which I'll list in the description below, that looks at when the oil pressure is below a minimum threshold, and then to measure that in two views. The first is to look at it in relation to how far the engine and vehicle has traveled in distance below that minimum oil pressure threshold, and how far in relation to time in terms of seconds. Now for the purpose of this video, I've got the oil pressure threshold trigger at any time the minimum threshold is below 30 psi, which actually is relatively high, but for the purposes of demonstration it works for this tutorial. Interestingly, if you want to be able to change that when you set up your math channel, you just need to nominate where you want your minimum trigger to be. Oftentimes I'd probably reset this one for my actual vehicle at 20 psi. And so what we want to have a look at, what does that show up? And so you can see here that if I look at these laps here where the minimum oil pressure is below 30, you can see that I can assess that in terms of, in this instance, we've gone 24.45 feet or 0.2 seconds below threshold. Here you can see that we've gone 109 feet or 1 second below that minimum threshold that is there. And so depending on what's happening, we can see that information. We can also see if it's triggered by certain variables. So one of the best things about having the laps here is you can see that as the laps progress, we may not have oil temperature as part of the setup, but we do have water temperature, which may be a good indication of engine temp. And so we can see that as that average increases, we can see that so potentially does the oil thin a little bit, and we start to see that minimum oil pressure flag trigger more often. And so interesting just to be able to watch out for that in a simple vehicle health analysis. But we want to go a bit further. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit the space bar here, and we're going to go to a user profile that I've set up for oil pressure analysis. And so we're going to load that up. If you're not sure about how to be able to create user profiles, I'll put a link in the top right hand side so you can link to setting up your profiles as how you want to be able to do so. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to color all the laps the same color, because I just want to see if there's consistency in when the oil pressure is triggered and if it's happening at exactly the same points on track, and if there's something that we need to be able to do from a driver input point of view, or whether it's something we need to be able to watch out from, an engine point of view, and whether the mechanics, race engineers, want to be able to change anything. Or similarly, if you engineer your own vehicle, you may want to change something. So I'm going to hit the space bar just to give a little bit more space on the screen, and you can see that what I've got here is I've got a channel that triggers in terms of a 1 and a 0 when the vehicle is below that 30 psi threshold and where it's happening. Now the reason I like having this as an on-off is I can click anywhere here and I can see where that's happening. So here you can see, for example, it's coming through COPS at Silverstone National here, and I can see that that's triggering. The other value to this is I can also add another variable, which is adding up how many times this threshold has been triggered, which is what powers that feature that I showed earlier in terms of the time and the distance that is there. But just having the ability to be able to see where allows you to be able to make some decisions on track. And so you can see that it's consistently happening in certain spots. So well worth having a look in terms of what's happening there. I've added some additional variables on here. Now, unfortunately, we're set up, we do not have throttle position, but if you did have throttle position, you could get even more accurate analysis. The other thing you may also notice is that the sampling rate of the oil pressure right now is a little bit too high, so this is noisy, and future analysis will bring that down to a lower sampling so it's not as noisy on screen, but it still works for today's demo. Now what I've also added here is I've added in GPS latitudinal, because this is a great indicator of what forces are being exerted on the car in terms of left and right. and it may give an indication of whether the oil is moving around inside the car to be able to understand, is there something that's happening as the oil thins, and if there's a very hard G-force corner, is it moving the oil around a little bit too much? And you can see that it's interesting that that's actually happening here in COPS, that you can see that it's a right-hand turn and it's moving that G-force indicator into quite a high threshold overall in terms of the forces that this vehicle is experiencing in that particular corner, and so it's triggering. Now, remember, I've got this set at 30 psi for demonstration. If it were lower and that was still happening, it may be something to be able to have a look at and talk to your race engineer, who may have some ideas, or maybe you have your own ideas as to how to be able to solve and address that particular variable. Now, as we go through, there may be other things that are happening. There's a very consistent spot here, which is coming down to this tight right-hand corner that is here. If we look to this, the RPMs are dropping, there's no throttle, and so the engine is spooling down in relation to a gear change. Now, this looks like quite a slow gear change, so this could be an area where the driver could look at improving their blip of the throttle. It could be an area of just speeding up the gear change and being able to make sure that the engine RPMs don't drop down too low. But at the same time, you can see that the engine has sort of leveled off. But what's interesting here is that this is a transition point that goes through this particular section, and so as a result the oil's moving around a lot. So arguably you don't want the RPMs to drop too low and not be pumping that oil around the engine at this particular point. So hopefully this analysis is very useful for you to be able to get an idea of how to work with it. As said, I'll post the math channels in the description below, and you can see that if you just want to understand what I've done in terms of setup here, I've created this trigger that says if LT, that stands for lower than oil pressure, which is the name of my channel, 30 is the PSI, then trigger a 1 if it's below that and a 0 if it's not. And that's allowed me to be able to create that channel of the 1s and 0s, or the trigger points where it's on and off on the lap. Similarly, you can change that to time, which is the amount of time. That's the RPM one. Let's go to the oil pressure one. This formula just tells you how far throughout the lap that has been on. So I've got the minimum oil pressure, which was the name of this channel that I just created. So you always have to start with this one. And then similarly, you can look at distance, which is this formula that tells you how far, by looking at speed and that channel multiplied, and then looking at miles per hour to feet, how far that's actually been on as well. So these are useful. I'll post them below so you can use them. I hope that you found this video useful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. If there's things that you want to be able to know, or I didn't cover, or you didn't like the video, please comment below and let me know what we can do better next time that is there. And so thanks so much for watching, and please, if you want to subscribe, that'd be lovely. So thank you.